So today we're going to inventory the alphabet of multispecies studies, and this is the first of a two-part event series. And some of the letters have already been posted online, so you can go to multispeciessalon.org, ABC, and see a few letters that we already have there. So we already have M for microbiopolitics, P for paraethnography, P for poaching, and S for swarm. So this alphabet project is in dialogue with others who've taken inventory of keywords, namely Deleuze and Roland Barthes, who've aimed to capture emergent concepts that are not fully formed, but that start to take on order within alphabetic logics. So in codifying these ABCs of Multispecies Studies, we're reaching out to a swarm of creative agents, people who are poachers, who are taking on the ideas of others and trespassing into their lexicon, as well as authors who've coined their own concepts. Alphabets are often a search for roots, which is why an encyclopedia arose, perhaps, as a genre alongside disciplines that produced origin myths. So in the domains of high art and early enterprises of colonial anthropology, there were intellectuals that gave prestige to originals and origins. And recent refusals to conform to these sorts of standards of validity, both artists and anthropologists have turned away from genealogical practices and projects that require an established pedigree. So we're creating a kind of alphabet that reaches to the biological as well as the etymological, containing both roots and rhizomes. Authors of the multispecies ABCs are moving beyond the domain of ethnography, as in multispecies ethnography, to bring in key morphemes from geography, ecology, archaeology, history, queer theory, as well as other allied intellectual traditions. Letters will represent more than one word. So for today, we've got both care and charisma for the letter C. And rather than privilege our favorite literal organisms, this project is about words that have figural potential. So P can work for parasite if you're playing with the idiom of Michel Serres. So alphabets can tell us much about what we know as well as what we don't know. So Deleuze's alphabet project uses the letters X and Y to stand for the unknown variables, the black boxes of knowledge that contain these uncharted elements. Yet the lacunas of language are not empty. So in taking our orientation for this alphabet project, we're not pointing to a text, but a museum. The Danish Cass collection, one of Europe's finest art collections, offers an archaeological perspective on types of alphabetic knowledge. So this is a quote from Bjorn Norgard. He says, "In the 60s, we believed that the physical work of art was empty, but what a postmodern philosopher referred to as a simulacrum instead turned out to be like an alphabet in language, a vantage point for even recent art forms. Form, color, line is the basic alphabet of visual art, just like the A, B, C, D, and E on the keyboard. Visual art, like science, is based on layer upon layer of accumulated knowledge through generations, through reference, through rebellion, quotes, citations, new theories, stealing of other people's work and ideas, the work of charlatans, the work of heresy, and so on. So this is really an indexical project. We're both trying to take inventory of what people are already doing in the field of multispecies studies, and also sort of point to the multiple strands of thought that are coming together in this project. So both, again, moving laterally like a rhizome and deep into the soil root. Ultimately, you can't argue with a dictionary. You can only write a new one. And this provocation that I just read, it was crafted by Craig Schütze, who can't be here today. And this is really the work of a multitude. So in starting out this multitude, I'm going to turn to Elon and ask him to do the letter A for animal.
Should I come closer to the microphone?
Sure, you can come right up here.
Okay. I'm losing my mountains for a second. All right, so A is for animal. The word animal comes from the Latin word animalis, meaning having breath. Aristotle first divided the living world between animals and plants, which was, of course, followed later by Linnaeus's more complicated hierarchical classification system. Animals have several unique characteristics from a biological perspective. They are eukaryotic and multicellular. They're heterotrophic. They feed on other living things. Most undergo some form of sexual reproduction, although they can also reproduce asexually. Animals are motile. They move in some form, not always throughout the entire life, but at least at some life stage. In other words, we're breathing, procreating, mobile meat. Animal is the category in which humans are contained, but against which they try so hard to distinguish themselves as exceptionally other. For multispecies studies, the human-animal construct is almost always implicated, since humans are so spatially ubiquitous. So it's particularly important to question how assumptions about human exceptionalism in relation to other animals affects the relationships that we study. French philosopher Dominique Listel offers a useful lens in the metaphor of a hand. So what is at stake, this is quoting Listel, what is at stake are in fact differences of differences, and not differences of competencies. The thumb is very different from the little finger, but to make it an entity that is ontologically distinct from the hand would be a mistake. As part of the same hand, and despite their real differences, thumb and little finger belong to the same category. Even if such a determination hurts the vanity of the thumb. Many animals are different from other animals. Is this difference similar to or different from the difference of humans from other animals? So the idea is not to try to erase the difference between humans and animals, but to think of animality as a hand upon which we are unique digits, a non-hierarchical continuum of animal difference. So I will say we from here on out in talking about animals, including humans along with all the other ones. Beyond their biological characteristics, the animal collective shares many other traits common to many, though not necessarily all. The first of which, and perhaps most universal, is that we are paradoxical. We are violent. We eat other living beings to survive, many of us other animals. You could even say we are cannibals if you reorient the relevant taxonomical category from species to kingdom. Yet we also are social and empathic. We practice altruism and mutual aid, as has been documented as far back as Russian naturalist Peter Kropotkin in the 19th century. And returning to the topic of food, we don't only make food out of other beings, we are eventually all food ourselves. We are all predator and prey. I'm sure we can all think of more animal paradoxes, but I'm going to move on to some other collective traits now. Many of us are sentient, emotional, and ethical, living complex intellectual and affective lives. We're beings of communication through language, oral cues, body gestures, chemicals, and touch, which means we are knowledge producers. We're territorial beings. As Deleuze discusses in his own animal entry in the ABCs animal forms of communication to demarcate boundaries to establish and defend territories. We also fabricate structures to further lay claim to what we consider ours. We are thus also propertied, laboring, value-creating beings. We are also aesthetic beings. Art is interwoven with these territorializing practices. Animals decorate, sculpt, paint, make music through percussions, vocal notes, and body vibrations, and accomplish complex and sophisticated architectural feats. Marx's bees come to mind here, and maybe how much he perhaps underappreciated them. Claiming a territory, Deleuze argues, is where art began. And finally, I'll end with a return to a last paradox, our individuality and our collectivity. Most, if not all, animals possess both. We are individuals within larger social collectives, sometimes single species and sometimes multi-species. This is always important to keep in mind in studying multi-species relationships, to be careful about the metonymic slippage that can occur between the individual animals we encounter and the larger collective to which they belong.
So we've got Be for Becoming that's already online. Kate Wright will be presenting that next month on October 20th, and I'd like to go straight to letter C for Charisma by Jamie Lorimer.
Thanks, Kevin. Naturalists often talk about charismatic species, familiar aesthetic organisms that inspire public affection. Elephants, tigers, and pandas are global archetypes of that genre. Such animals and occasionally plants are the flagships of contemporary environmentalism. Their behavior and ecology are known to science and are frequently used to raise awareness of broad issues. They're commodified to fund interventions and work as boundary objects, enabling different epistemic communities to work together, often at a distance. How might we conceive of this non-human charisma and the work it does in the salvatory political ecologies of conservation in the Anthropocene? So charisma comes from the Greek word charisma, meaning gift of grace. For Max Weber, who was is one of the most influential commentators on charisma, albeit human charisma, he understands it as a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. Non-human charisma, understood this way, describes the features of a particular organism that configure its perception by humans and its subsequent evaluation. Charisma is a relational property. It's contingent upon the perceiver and the context in which any interspecies encounter takes place. Discussions of charisma tend to focus on what I've elsewhere termed aesthetic charisma. This describes the visual appearance of a species in print, on film, or in the spectacular encounters of ecotourism. We can widen the scope of what we understand to constitute and configure charisma to encompass the material properties of an organism, what we might call its ecological charisma, and the feelings engendered in proximal multisensory encounters, what I call corporeal charisma. Okay, so we take each of those in turn. Ecological charisma describes the anatomical, geographical, temporal properties of an organism that configure its detectability by a human subject. It relates to the human umwelt, to use Jacob von Oxkel's term, the bubble in which we make sense of the world. So as Ilan was talking about, all of us human animals are warm-blooded, potentially omnivorous. Most humans are bipedal, between 1.4 and 1.9 meters tall, terrestrial, diurnal, i.e. we're out in the day rather than at night most of the time. Unlike most terrestrial mammals that communicate with pheromones, we depend on vision and privilege visual knowledge. Human sensory organs make use of small portions of the electromagnetic, the acoustic, and the olfactory spectra for perception and communication. Therefore, an organism's detectability to us is influenced by its size, its colour, its shape, its degree, and its speed of movement, all in relation to the human umwelt, to our bubble. It's also shaped by oral characteristics such as the presence or absence of a noise, call, sound, and the frequency and magnitude of this sound. Taken together, these constitute what naturalists call an organism's GIS. GIS is an acronym, general impression of size and shape. It's often used in field studies. Rebecca Ellis has a nice piece about GIS. In conservation parlance, aesthetic charisma is generally seen as a positive accolade associated with organisms to which one could apply the adjectives cute and cuddly, like the panda, or fierce and deadly, like the tiger. But aesthetic charisma doesn't guarantee a positive response from human publics. The landscape of this aesthetics can be starkly polarized in relation to both the characters and the feelings they invoke in different audiences. But there's a consistent vital force at work here that seems to bring some species to the forefront of popular attention. For example, both elephants and cockroaches are charismatic, but their charisma causes strong and divergent responses. Different organisms can be both awesome and awful. These popular responses to the aesthetics of organisms appear to be arranged along an axis of anthropomorphism that commonly elevates, but occasionally denigrates, life in forms like us. Organisms with hands, with a face, or with eyes, organisms that can be individuated, organisms that show some reciprocity, all figure prominently in the taxonomy of this form of concern. And then finally, corporeal charisma refers to the feelings organisms engender in proximal, practical, and sometimes enduring interactions with humans. This is a diverse form with many different affective logics that apply to the structures of feeling that emerge in particular relational contexts. Farming, hunting, and pet keeping value different organisms by virtue of their contrasting aims, contrasting desires, habituated practices. Eating, killing, and caring disproportionately configure different organisms. In the more esoteric realm that I've looked at most closely of natural history, organisms gain corporeal charisma by virtue of how they afford desired cultural and epistemic affects. For example, moments of epiphany that you would get in bird spotting, routine practices of surveillance that encourage a certain commonality amongst those engaging with them, or of abstraction. Beetles in particular are apparently very satisfying to classify in the field. There's something about the properties of that class of organisms that lend themselves to a certain type of abstract formulation. So there's clearly a taxonomy to this charisma that comes to shape the scope and political economies of environmental concern. Charismatic species feature disproportionately in the databases and designations that perform conservation. They populate institutions of captivity as sacrificial ambassadors for the salvation of their free-ranging kin. They dominate the mediascapes that frame popular sensibilities towards wildlife. Commodified and powered up through forms of market environmentalism, they span the globe, serving as cosmopolitan ambassadors for ascendant modes of global environmentalism. Charisma here becomes political in situations of discord, where the hopes and dreams of powerful animal lovers meet livelihoods in cohabitation or conflict with local wildlife. Elephants and tigers would be classic examples. Attending to charisma here then allows us to attune to the lively and effective ecologies of contemporary environmentalism.
Thank you. Next we have E for Ethnography by Jeffrey Bussolini. Let's see. Oops. Okay, I think you should go.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for including me, and great stuff so far. It's a wonderful set of considerations. I'm going to speak just a little bit about ethnography. Ethnography comes from the Greek. If we look at Liddell, Scott, and James' lexicon, we can see it comes from ethnos, which means people, and graphein, which means writing. If you look at the fairly lengthy entry on ethnos, it's really primarily and for the most part really about human people. Specifies human habitations, human cultures, human groups, nations, tribes, assemblage of people, number of people, things like that. And indeed, in the Greek context and in most of the context within anthropology and sociology that are the main disciplines to use ethnography, although of course it's used in many other disciplines as well, like geography, for instance, but it's had most of its history and development in anthropology and sociology. And there, for the most part, it's almost always been applied to humans, to studying human groups and human interactions and that kind of thing. And there are probably some reasons for that. Anthropology is, after all, anthropos, logos, study of humans, and sociology looks at companionship, and for the most part it's just assumed that that companionship and group formation takes place between humans, not between humans and other animals. But that doesn't mean that those traditions haven't also reflected some other approaches. And even in the Greek itself, kind of buried in the lexicon entry, there's a kind of a third meaning of ethnos, which is a swarm or a flock, like of birds. So it connects to the entry about swarm, which we're going to have in the lexicon or the abecedare. And it indicates that even in the root of the term itself, there's some attention to animals and animality. And sociology and anthropology, even if they may, for the most part, have been focused on human people, have also addressed at times other non-human actors. If you look, for instance, at some classic works in anthropology, like in Claude Lévi-Strauss, you frequently see animals that figure in as part of hybrid human-animal communities in the ethnography. And Marcel Mauss, who was an important figure in both anthropology and sociology, and who was the nephew of Emile Durkheim, already had a lot of considerations about human-animal interactions as part of his general schematic formulations about sociology and anthropology. And in fact, the very first sociology dissertation that was ever completed and defended in France at the Sorbonne was about animal societies. So even before sociology kind of diverted into primarily addressing humans, it was first of all focused about animal societies and animal cultures. In the recent decades, we see many different anthropologists and sociologists taking use of ethnography to try to step beyond the anthropocentric frame and also include non-human animals and other types of actors, even plants or microorganisms. For instance, Tim Ingold has, in many different locations, considered the role of animals and humans in interaction. Deborah Bird Rose has looked a lot at the interface and interrelationship between humans and non-human animals in making meaning and making culture. Donna Haraway, of course, has looked at many different frameworks for encounter and interrelation between humans and animals. And within sociology, we have some figures like Clint Sanders, who has taken especially dogs, but other animals too, as serious partners in communication and interaction. We have Janet and Stephen Alger, who wrote a path-breaking ethnography of cat culture, looking at feline interactions and feline-human interactions in a shelter. And let's see, I don't want to leave anyone out. Yes, Leslie Irvine, of course, has written a string of wonderful books using ethnography and symbolic interactionism to look at the way in which subjectivity is formed and intersubjectivity is formed between humans and animals. Then, of course, drawing on all of these traditions and formulations, Evan Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich have recently articulated the idea of multi-species ethnography that really draws on and draws in a lot of these ideas that many of us have been working with for a long time, and other people like Deborah Berg-Rose and Donna Haraway before us. And multi-species ethnography also places an emphasis on obviously trying to take account of actors that extend beyond the human realm. There's a few thinkers that I'll mention just by way of wrapping up here who have also tried to bridge the gap between ethnography and ethology, and they've realized that even though the particular disciplinary formations might be different, i.e. biology or the socials, that there's a lot of methodological and observational similarity between the techniques of ethology and ethnography, namely long-term field observation that's paired with meticulous note-taking and trying to look at behavior and trying to look at interactions. So as a result, I think several things are happening. On the one hand, even in anthropology, biological anthropologists have long used the study of animals, especially primates, to try to get a better understanding of human being and human behavior. But beyond that, it's now pretty well accepted in ethology in general that culture is part of the animal realm. And now that that's been realized, I think many ethologists realize that they can borrow techniques and expertise from anthropologists and sociologists who have been studying culture for a long time. And they don't have to reinvent the wheel, but they can draw on these traditions of study that are there. So as a result, there's a lot of collaborations that are taking place between biological scientists and social scientists, as well as philosophers and artists and others. Alain already mentioned Dominique Lestel, who's outlined what he calls an etho-ethnography or ethno-ethology, which is a fusion of the disciplines of ethnography and ethology to try to be able to take account of human, non-human, hybrid animal communities and to try to take some of the best practices and insights from the methods of each discipline. And he sees that as part of what he calls a cultural zoology, akin to cultural anthropology, that he thinks is going to be more and more the future of ethology. Vinciane Desprez, for her part, a colleague of Dominique Lestel's, has practiced what she calls an ethology of ethologists to try to look at the way that meaning and culture are formed between human researchers and non-human animals in different contexts of research. Roberto Marcassini, an Italian biologist, has spent a long time describing what he calls zoanthropologia or zooanthropology, which also draws on ethology, ethnography, and cognitive science to give a more robust picture of these kind of interactions. And then finally, his teacher, Roberto Marcassini's teacher, Giorgio Celli, who was an ethologist, mostly studied bees, was also very interested by cats, and he's published several books about cat ethology. And one of his important books about ethology was called An Ethology of the Household, or An Ethology of the Living Space. So he explicitly realized that ethology could be applied to so-called human-built environments or human living environments, and that we could see a lot of different human, non-human animal interactions taking place in those spaces that we ordinarily treat, just by assumption, really, as exclusively human spaces. So those are just a few trails or directions, a few notes on this issue of ethnography as it pertains to non-human animal lovers. Thank you.
So next we have another entry for the letter E, Eco Art by Karen Bolander, who's doing some of the intersectional work that Jeff was just talking about at the edge of ethnography, ethology, and art.
Okay, and I want to note too that this particular entry I wrote in collaboration with Diana Pindell, who's a wonderful practicing ecological artist doing a lot of work in remediation and a lot of work with play. And she couldn't be here today, but I'm just going to offer what we concocted together. From working within the field of ecological art, we wanted to provide sort of an overview. So the key defining feature of ecological art may be the striking diversity of its creative interventions. Its practitioners engage many different means to draw attention and aesthetic interest towards ecological problems. But to try to focus in on what a commonality of ecological practices, which are very diverse in style, form, content, materials. There is, in common with all eco-art practices, an ecocentric focus, as opposed to, say, an anthropocentric focus, or what Linda Weintraub would call an egocentric focus, to draw a distinction there. Ecological artists come from common Western art historical roots, for the most part. This is a fairly, in terms of art history, a fairly new field, probably about 50 years old or so. But the roots are in land art, and I have a caveat here because within ecological art there's some fractious discussion about land art, because some people feel that the minimalist land artists of the 60s and so forth were not considering the effects of their work on the earth that they were moving around. For instance, Spiral Jetty, which is Robert Smithson's work that you may be familiar with, in which he made a huge jetty in the Great Salt Lake. But in spite of the fact that, you know, ecological considerations were not at the forefront, artistically, the direct interaction with land and with place in this particular way, you know, rocks and the movements of water and so forth as materials for art, conceptually and physically, are a precursor of ecological art. And but in any case, some people reject that for that reason. But perhaps more importantly, at least from Diana and my perspective, is the role of activist performance, and particularly feminist art, in the coming around in the 70s and so on in Western art. Because this allowed artists to directly engage conceptually performance and to actually act in the environment within the art world. And then with the growing environmental concerns of that era, there was a real fusion of the ability of the artist to actively and directly intervene in ecological sites and issues. So let's see. A few artists that were pioneers: Merle Ukele's, Joseph Beuys, Agnes Dennis, Helen Mayer and Newton Harrison, Hans Hacke, Jackie Bruckner, and many others have engaged modes of what we would call durational performance, so over a long term, which of course is important when you're thinking ecologically in art. You don't just have the one painting that sits on the wall, but you have an engagement over time with cycles and places and becomings. And then direct remediative action, so to, you know, remediate a site in a particular way. This was going on in the 60s and 70s. The pioneer works were beginning to think this way about what art could do directly in the environment. But I think what's important to point out is that these forms artistically reflect and model the complexity that ecological thinking in general asks of us, as opposed to the sort of the standard humanist idea of the masterpiece sculpture that stands outside of time and outside of any sort of, you know, direct engagement with a cultural, you know, your Michelangelo or so forth, the classic humanist masterpiece. So this is a very different mode of thinking, and as I teach eco art to undergraduate students, it's funny how these are completely radical ideas coming out of the humanist tradition of thinking about art. So it's fun to do that. And there are a lot of different terms for what we would call ecological art more broadly, many in the art world and in the art historical tradition. You can call it socially engaged artwork, or you know, there's any number of sort of bifurcating ideas about what it is. But I think that something else that holds it together is what Susie Gablick calls connective aesthetics. So the idea that there is not just one thing, but the beauty is in the coming together, the sort of knot, maybe, what Haraway would call it, of many different forces and agents and beings, and that the framing of that by the artist in some way is beautiful. That's sort of connective aesthetics. So Deanna offered a sort of overview of remediative work, which is an important aspect of ecological art, and particularly art-science collaboration. So scientists and artists have been working together to come up with these art-science collaborations, and specific grounding gives the work an authenticity and functionality toward addressing relevant challenges in, obviously, our increasingly damaged world. And then she pointed out a keystone art-science collaboration, which is a work called Revival Field by the artist Mel Chin and a scientist named Dr. Rufus Cheney, in which they undertook the remediation of a Superfund site by repeatedly planting and harvesting hyperaccumulator plants that would actually draw toxins from the soil. And over time, this was begun in 1991 and is an ongoing project. But they discovered that this is a really fractious piece, because initially it had NEA funding, but then the NEA revoked its funding because it was questioning whether this was actually art. And so this is a classic moment in this movement, because there was a big debate about whether this durational project of actually using plants to draw toxins from the soil could be considered art. Of course, now it's a keystone of the movement. So, and let's see, Revival Field and other collaborations like this over time draw insights from multiple disciplines. And they have really heralded a shift towards the interdisciplinary terrain of ecological art. And so just to name, or I guess to conclude, I suppose, artists have applied eco-art principles to intervene in practically every environmental arena: agriculture, food production, water quality, habitat restoration, land and sea, nuclear radioactivity, decontamination of toxic soils, as in Revival Field, alternate energy production, eco-art is these days a movement that is so broad and reaching out into so many different areas that there really isn't an environmental or ecological problem that you could think of that an artist hasn't intervened in some way. And the scale of works is also very broad. There's a work called Seed Bombs by Catherine Miller that involves essentially, packets of seeds bombed on sites that the environment. The Harrisons, who are sort of pioneers of the movement, are working in a very elaborate way with an entire watershed, or they have worked on the watershed, on the larger landscape, even regional level. So I guess most importantly, ecological art articulates connections between diverse agents, challenges and expands conventional ideas about art, what the role of the artist, and on this bringing together larger, huge, many strands of ideas, and expands, of course, conventional ideas about the role of creative imagination, essentially, in political, social, and most importantly, environmental change. So hopefully that sums it up.
So we've got two letter H's. We have H for hacking and H for hope. So let's invite Helen Pritchard from Goldsmiths to do hacking.
Okay, hi. Okay, so hacking, hacks, hackers, and to hack. In 2010, I met a cat called Brother Cream at a magazine store in Chim Sha Tsui in Hong Kong. And this cat was wearing his kind of paper sunglasses and posing for selfies with tourists. In that year, his superfans also created a Facebook, and quickly he became Facebook famous through lots of likes on his page. And since then, he's received over 1,000 visitors a day at his magazine shop, as well as promoting various products and having his own cookbook. In a way, Cream Cat is one of the kind of new arrangements of digital networks, and through kind of remote sensing, biotechnologies, cloud computing, data storage, YouTube, sensations, these new entanglements of apparatus and entities, the scope of what we understand as computing now kind of enrolls a multi-species on a planetary scale. And really, in this kind of multi-species studies, internet famous cats and transgenic glowfish, wildcat selfies, robo cockroaches, the cockroaches which have microcontrollers implanted in their bodies, are these new figures who both exploit and are exploited by computational ecologies. So the transgenic glowfish, the wildcat selfies, the robo-cockroaches are all perhaps forms of hackers, or undertaking the process of hacking, as they are not only exploited by computation but also exploit. These articulations are not always compliant with computation. In that way, we can also think of multi-species hacking in those terms. And hacking itself is, in fact, a form or act of worlding. So from a kind of buffer overflow in the computational system to what in exploit computing we might call the weird machine theory, hacking is as much about this process of exploiting vulnerabilities as it is a process of potentiation, a process in which new entities emerge, and a process in one way or another, a kind of virtual potentiality of the weird machine is released by these multi-species hackers. As Tatiana Bazzicelli explained in her book about the Italian hacker movement, although that was very much talking about the kind of human hackers, hacking is the creation of disturbance and the creation of intervention, one that gives rise to paradoxes, fakes, and pranks. So hacking is really a kind of double bond. It's both the breaking up of a surface or a border, and also the process of gaining access to a computation ecology, and that might be illegally or without authorization. And in multi-species studies, we can think of this as a process that's very much undertaken as a kind of concentration or a relational knot, an act of worlding across humans and more than humans. So in exploit computing, when we open up the computational system, we create something else. So it's the possibility of new worldings, but these possibilities aren't always good worldings. And in hacking theory, we might talk about this idea of the black hat hacker or the white hacker, but that these new worldings are neither good or bad, but are new configurations. And very much as Marina Johnson, the member of the Multi-Species Salon Collective, describes, as cited by Eben Kurtzky, when she discusses biohackers, they're also kind of the figures of nightmares and possible threats to existing arrangements among species, peoples, institutions, and nations. So these hackers that emerge from multi-species computation provide, as Donna Haraway might suggest, an intimate, pervasive, and profound reconfiguration of more than human bodies, both human and more than human, and that they configure and reconfigure new territorial, political, economic, and aesthetic social borders of both environment and more than human bodies. So this idea of hacking as the hacking across the surface or across the border. So for me, the work that I've been doing with the animal hacker is a proposition to consider within the context of environmental computing, Haraway's call to open up the question of non-humanism, to break down the existing abstractions of nature and computation in order that more richer and more responsive inventions, speculations and proposings or worldings can go on. Once we start to think about computation as something that can be reconfigured through kind of a concentration of humans and non-humans, we might start to think, as Bifo Berardi discusses, that the effects of code and computation are not, as assumed, completely deterministic. And as far as code as the product of code and writing, that they are affected by the social, political, cultural, emotional and environmental processes. So therefore, hacking in multi-species studies can perhaps be considered in Haraway's terms as relational knots, or as I might discuss, as a kind of concentration or magnetism, and that the proposition of hacking code or hacking from the multi-species perspective as a kind of line of escape across the surface or border.
Thank you. So I'm going to stick with letter H and do hope. So powerful forces have tried to steal the very idea of hope. As an empty political slogan, hope has bulldozed over our dreams. Yet, in the aftermath and blasted landscapes that have been transformed by multiple catastrophes, it's still possible to find hope. So the flood of oil spreading in the Gulf of Mexico set the backdrop for the Multi-Species Salon in New Orleans in 2010. This uninterrupted flood of oil was the actualization of one artist, Jacqueline Bishop's worst nightmares. And I'm going to show some of Jacqueline's artwork in the background as I talk here. So this is a 2004 mixed media installation called Trespass, and it was first exhibited in the months before Hurricane Katrina, very much a premonition of what was to come. This assemblage of flotsam and jetsam, it includes baby shoes, bird nests, toys, balls of twine. It contained this aesthetic prediction about what was about to happen with the floating debris that were omnipresent after the storm. Coated in a dark glossy finish that was like crude oil, this artwork also prefigured the oil flood that came 6 years later in 2010. If at a distance, Trespass initially seems to be this uniform black morass, a dreadful rendering of disaster, closer inspection reveals colorful organisms hiding in the shadows. Mushrooms, seed pods, and bird eggs anchor hopes in living forms. Like a bird nest built from scavenged debris, Trespass nurtures hopeful dreams. In other words, it illustrates that hope can move like oil and water. This point emerges when the artwork is viewed with shifts of scale. As a sea slick with oil and wreckage, an unfathomable disaster is viewed from afar. Yet still, when you zoom back in, there's anchoring points for hopeful desires that can only be grasped at a molecular level. Zooming in reveals that when droplets merge together, when they grab a hold of almost imperceptible figures, they generate dynamic coalescences. Panning back out reveals the dance of oil and water. In the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon explosion, hope certainly moved like oil and water. As a long-awaited nightmare became reality, it produced order-destroying dreaming and as well as the conditions of possibility for hopeful order-forming coalescences. The masses started to move. Out on the streets, people called for BP executives to be jailed. They agitated to disrupt the predictable flows of global capital. Out in the bayous and on the beaches, thousands of people volunteered in the cleanup effort. If the early years of the 21st century seemed to be a moment when power relations were fixed in place, when nothing ever seemed to really change, this homogeneous empty time was quickly giving way to a revolutionary or messianic time, a moment of political possibility when collective desires began to coalesce around multiple figures and future events. A figure might be regarded as a fashioning, a resemblance, a shape, also a chimerical vision, and that's if you follow Nathaniel Bailey's 1730 Dictionarium Britannicum. To figure also means to have a role in a story. Gathering up desires, figure also serves as anchoring points for dreams. Let's see if I can get my face back. Oil is a potent figure of hope. As individuals searched for hopeful possibilities in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon explosion, discrete figures populated their dreams, like oil droplets dancing about on the surface of water. They bumped into each other. Figural oil bubbles coalesced, becoming more perceptible, a glimmering sheen spreading through the sea of collective imagination. The potent toxicity of this shimmering liquid gathered together expansive desires, serving as a common object, anchoring diverse hopes. In a word, the oil spreading in the Gulf embodied the indeterminate nature of the pharmacon, a poisonous substance that can double as a remedy, a poison that can serve as a cure. The pharmacon, according to Isabel Stingers, is something with those indeterminate properties. It can produce an obstacle, but also an opportunity. The figurative power of oil and water provided an opening for a multitude in New Orleans who desired to cure the ills of extractive capitalism. The seemingly unstoppable flood of oil of petrochemicals became a call for a collective response, spurning a swarm of creative agents into revolutionary action. So next I'm going to go back to letter C, C for Care by Tom Van Doren. So Tom is in New York City right now. He's in such high demand that he's only able to be here as a virtual talk right now at the American Museum of Natural History. But fortunately, we've got a video, and I'm going to show that video right now, if I can figure out how to do it. Okay. So it sounds like some people weren't able to hear the audio on that video. We're going to post it online as soon as we're done here. So that was Tom Van Doren talking about care. And I'd just like to thank everyone who's participated in this event today. So we have, again, from the CUNY Graduate Center here in New York, we've got Ilan Abrel, we've got Jeff Bussolini. From Oxford, we have Jamie Lorimer. And from Goldsmiths, we have Helen Pritchard. And from UNSW Australia, the Environmental Humanities Program, but broadcasting from Washington State, we have Karen Bolander. So do people have burning questions that they want to ask each other, or should we call it a day and wait for the next installment of the alphabet?
I wonder if most of these, what we said today, are going to be posted online mostly as they are. Is that the case?
Yeah, so what you've sent in to me will be posted on the internet. We'll get back with you if we have any sort of editorial feedback. But I was thinking more like questions, and I think like let's just wrap it up. We'll continue the conversation over email, and thanks again for everyone for participating.
Can I ask one thing?
Jeff wants to ask a question.
Karen, I was wondering, I found that really interesting when you were talking about, it's called durational eco-art, right?
Yeah, well, durational performance is probably the broader term for, that doesn't always have an ecocentric focus, but has certainly been adopted by the ecological artists because it really fuses well with ecological thinking and concerns.
Okay. Thank you. I find that really alive, interesting concept. And Dominique Lestel, who we were talking about, has a book about animal friendship, and the kind of the framework or the backbone, so to speak, of his account of animal friendship is based on duration and Bergson. So it seems like there could be some interesting interplay or exchange between those thinkings of duration. And so I look forward to finding out more about the artwork. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
And any other questions while we're all on the line here? Okay, with that, just thanks to everyone, and yeah, see more of you very soon. Back on the same channel.
Thank you.
October 20th.
All right. Thank you, everyone.